Just a few housekeeping things first of all. There is water in cups on your table. There is also more water just on the far wall. Toilets are out the back door and to the left. And of course, if there is an emergency, this would be our closest exit up here, my left, most of your right. So please exit through that door if we have to for an emergency. We do have a couple of apologies this evening. Apologies from Kevin Anderson. It is a New South Wales Parliament sitting week. But we do welcome Luke Massey from Kevin's staff. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And we'd like to acknowledge a lot of support from Kevin's office for this evening. Through printing the posters and the flyers and getting the word out, we're very grateful for what he's done for us to make this a viable option for us to have in Tamworth this evening. Of course, also thanks to Wests for hosting us. A couple of apologies. Apology from our Mayor who had a prior engagement this evening, and also from Phil Spark. But we do acknowledge that Councillor Helen Tickle, Councillor Mark Rodder, Councillor Steve Mears and Councillor Judy Coates are all here with us this evening. First off, if we could please welcome Len Waters, Kamilaroi man and cultural educator from our region, to do a welcome to country. Thank you, Len.
Thank you, Alice. Yamamaya, greetings friends, and Gabayarada. Good afternoon. My name is Lenny Waters. I'm a Kamilaroi man, and I come from Toomala Mission Station. And old people out of Toomala, they move from place to place. But up near the old mission where I come from is a place called Booba Lagoon. But the old name for Booba Lagoon was Gunningal. And Gunningal in our language means never-ending water. Because that place is a big dreamtime place of creatures from long ago. And that place never depended on any rain or floods to keep it full. Because all the water from those beautiful lagoons of Gunningal were filled from beneath the earth. The water would come from beneath to keep those lagoons full at all times. And the old rivers that used to pass by the missions there, the old Barman, he was our male river, the big brown fella. And of course, closer to home here, we have the Namoi, or Ngamul, as it used to be called, our female river. But as they gather all the nutrients from the country and meet at a place called Rarina, out of Walgett, the joining of the rivers, all the fish spawn there, all the grasses, all the aquatic life, birds, insects and animals come to feast upon where these two rivers join. But before I do your welcome tonight, I'd just like to share a story from our old people. I've always been a person of the sky, the stars, and our universe. And the old people used to always tell us stories, because those stories that are written in the stars are all about us. They're all about people and their roles and their responsibilities to country. But my old grandmother's people in Woorori, when the Creator first walked among us, he gave them the sacred fires. And the sacred fires used to hold great power, and they couldn't be viewed upon just by any normal person. But the neighbouring tribe got restless, and they said, why do those people get the sacred fires and not us? So in the dead of night, they come with their coolamans, and they scooped up the sacred fires and took off, only to be caught by the clever man, the Wurrinen, and of course, the Creator, hoisted the fires into the night sky, and then vanished the thieves into the dark spaces of our universe. And he put his big warriors there with their long spears and boomerangs to keep guard over the fire. At this time of year, we have Gidgigamba and Gudgigamba, the two sacred fires. They're on their journey towards the horizon as they set in the west at the end of their journey through the winter months. I'm talking about the pointers to the Southern Cross. But in the sky next to them, you see a big black marking coming through our universe, and they refer to it as the big water snake. that is full of evil from the other side of our universe. And it wants to come to Earth here to wreak havoc and to cause chaos. But our warriors, they battle the great serpent. And the battle rages on and on and on. And our warriors look towards the sacred fires and gain their strength from them to ward off the evil from the other side. And their battle continues today. What that means to us as people is that we also must ward off all bad things. But it's a story about humanity, and humanity is all about looking after one another. And we must pick up our fallen. We must shelter our people that have nothing. We must provide for those that are hungry and thirsty. And these days, we see less and less of that. And maybe if we look towards our sacred fires, Gidgee Gambler and Gudgee Gambler, maybe we will gain the strength to also offer humanity to our fellow people and lift them up so that we can all be equal, but fight for a common good, just like our warriors in the dark spaces of our universe. But good on you, Yamada, come on, Yamada. Welcome on your mob, welcome to country. This is the strong lands of the Kamilaroi. Go well and be safe here. Kabamagia, Kalagala, Uriah, Kidday, Miri. And then on the Bakomobi. Let's give praise to the Creator. What a heavens, beautiful earth that we come upon. He is who he says he is, and he is good. Great Father. You know your bum and bright. Go with God. And thank you very much for inviting me along to do your welcome tonight. I know it's been a little bit long, but I think it's worthwhile when we're talking about such a great subject to actually have a little bit of something to maybe mix in with it. It's like a sugar in your tea. Gabba Bullawee, have a good evening. Once again, thank you for inviting me along. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Len. We will now have Tony Windsor's message. Just a moment.
Good evening, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for not being able to be there tonight to chair the meeting. But Lynn has leukemia, and at this stage of her chemo treatment, the doctors have suggested it's probably not the best thing for me to be in a closed environment. And obviously, I want to shake hands with people that are there. And anyway, that's as it is. But I congratulate you for taking the initiative to be part of the conversation. Perhaps it's a conversation that should have started many years ago, but it is starting, and you have some great speakers there tonight. Len Waters, of course, the great man from Tamworth, who's always been there for all our people. To Bruce Logan, representing the Regional Council. Bruce knows the numbers backwards and has always been a good advisor to many of us, including myself in a previous lifetime. Stuart Kahn. Stuart's probably renowned now, I think, in terms of his knowledge of urban water and other water, but in terms of the politics of water, but also the practical delivery and costing of various water infrastructure. So Stuart will be a valuable man to have an objective conversation about these very real issues that are going to be facing the community of Tamworth into the future. Stuart's an old boy from Farrer too, so he's probably created a few misdemeanours on the Peel River down in front of Farrer, as all Farrer kids would have done at some stage or other in their careers, and I'm sure he'll confess all of that to you tonight. But I do thank you for taking the time. It is, as I said, a conversation that's probably overdue, and you people are actually starting it by your participation tonight. There are many alternatives, and I won't get into the politics of all of this, but there are many alternatives And I think through calm deliberation we'll be able to flesh through those alternatives and come up with ways in which the future water issues that face Tamworth and other communities can be delivered. So I wish you well, and as I said, thank you for your attendance, and my apology for not being able to be there. Have a good night.
Stuart, don't feel any pressure to actually tell us about the misdemeanors. So just an explanation for this evening's format and how it will work out. Many of you may not have been to an event like this before. So just to make you feel more comfortable with what's going to happen this evening. We will have some presentations, of course, by our expert guests, followed by an opportunity for both questions and discussions for the panel. We will have a roving mic, so please don't feel like you need to move from your chairs for this part. The evening is due to finish around 8 p.m. However, you are welcome to stay longer. Of course, just through these doors, there is both a restaurant and a bar, and we do have exclusive use of this room for this evening. So you are welcome to get something to eat or drink and bring it back here to continue discussions with those who've remained present. I'd like you now to welcome Bev Smiles. Bev is a member for Inland Rivers Network and of course also Tamworth Water Security Alliance, one of our member groups, and she'll give you some more background on this evening.
Thanks, Alice, and thank you, Lynn, for the heartfelt welcome to country. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Kamilaroi country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tamworth Water Security Alliance formed in 2020 with the aim of looking at all options available for securing water supply for Tamworth and surrounding districts. Inland Rivers Network is a statewide organisation interested in protecting the health of the rivers and wetlands in the Murray-Darling Basin. We joined the Alliance because we support sustainable water use and recognise the need to secure town water supply in inland New South Wales through the best use of modern technology. Tamworth is a large city on a very small river that is already overcommitted. Our rivers are not magic puddings that can keep on giving without dire environmental consequences. And a lot of good work has been undertaken by organisations such as the Water Services Association of Australia to assist local governments to manage urban water supply. Tamworth Water Security Alliance presented the previous council with a copy of the All Options on the Table document. Genuine consultation and discussion about the full range of water security options is an important step in the decision-making process and allocation of public funds. The aim of this forum, as Tony Windsor has mentioned, is to start the necessary conversation with the community so that everyone is informed of all the options available to improve the security of Tamworth water supply. We live on the driest inhabited continent on Earth with a highly variable climate, the extremes of which are now being magnified by climate change. This has been experienced over the past few years and is going to become more challenging with time. The New South Wales Government has invested in new climate modelling to help inform planning decisions with water availability as a key indicator. This is part of a new process of developing regional water strategies, including one for the Namoi region. So the Alliance has engaged quite closely in this process, and we hope that it will provide some positive outcomes and worthwhile investment decisions. We are particularly interested in support for a community education program on purified recycled water and the water savings it provides. Tamworth Tamworth Water Security Alliance is very pleased to celebrate National Water Week by organising this opportunity tonight to present information on what options are out there and the work that Tamworth Regional Council is already undertaking. It's very encouraging that you've all attended tonight to join in the discussion. Hopefully, this water forum is the first of many open and transparent conversations with the Tamworth community to increase understanding of the choices and the knowledge needed to make a community-led decision on the best, most cost-effective and efficient projects for securing Tamworth water supply into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bev. I'd now like to introduce Professor Stuart Kahn, who will be discussing options for water security in urban areas. Just wait, Stuart, you're very qualified. There is so much to tell people about you. Stuart is the Director of the Australian Graduate School of Engineering and a Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of New South Wales. He undertakes research and teaching on urban water supplies with a particular focus on water treatment and water quality, something I know that a lot of people here are passionate about tonight. From 2020 to mid-2022, Stuart was a member of the National Water Grid Advisory Body, appointed by the former Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack to provide expert advice on Commonwealth Government investments in water infrastructure. Please welcome Stuart Kahn.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks Bev and David and all the members of the Tamworth Water Security Alliance for inviting me to come and speak tonight. It's a very important topic. It's obviously my favourite topic, and it is important because sustainable water supplies are the most important thing, I think, for any city as it moves into the future, to think about where does water come from. Without water, the city can't exist. Without water, the city can't grow. The city can't have all of the beneficial employment and everything else that goes on within the city. I do want to be clear that I'm not here to tell you how Tamworth should manage water. That's a conversation for you to have. So the way I tend to have this discussion is I'm going to just show you some examples of what other cities are doing and the solutions that other cities have tried and found and implemented that have been useful to one degree or another. And another important point is there is no single solution. There's no silver bullet. Most cities that have good, resilient water supplies tend to have a resilient portfolio of water supplies. So it's not about saying it's A or B. In most cases, it's a bit of A, a little bit of B, and a tiny little bit of C, or quite a lot of C. All these options as they come together are important because that's what gets cities through the difficult times. So through drought, through floods, through bushfires, all of those things that threaten our water supplies, being able to pick and choose a little bit between different water supplies and adjust the ratios, the proportion that are coming from different parts of that portfolio, just like a shared portfolio. One share crashes, if you've got others in another area, you build resilience to external pressures. So when we start talking about water and where cities get water from, this is actually me looking like a very unimpressed teenager at Chaffey Dam in the late 80s sometime with my dad. And the first thing that many of our towns and cities, when we think about where do we get water from, we think about dams, especially river cities. Like Tamworth, we take that opportunity because that water is sitting there, and very often it's the rivers, the surface water, the dams that are the first things that we develop and we exploit as our water supplies. Water restrictions are actually also part of the equation. So some degree of tolerance for how frequently we might expect to have water restrictions is actually built into planning in terms of how much long-term sustainable yield we expect to have for our towns and cities. So we do go through water restrictions from time to time, and if we plan the way that we plan, that's something that we should expect, and we'll continue. And that leads us, of course, into thinking about water efficiency as one of the first stops when we start thinking, where can we get more water from? We can build infrastructure, but first of all, we can use the water that we have more efficiently. It's a bit hard to see this slide, but it's just simply making the point that Tamworth has plans to improve water efficiency. If we look at the current daily use or the current annual use of water for Tamworth, about half it's residential, half of it's the industrial customers, and there is a future target that squeezes down those numbers, and that's the way it should be. Cities should be ambitious about doing more with what they have. Another way that we often manage water in cities, and in fact in many places outside of cities, rely exclusively on rainwater tanks. There are plenty of properties that get all of their water, their drinking water, their flushing toilet water, their garden water from a rainwater tank. But even in cities where we have reticulated supplies, there's lots of opportunity to take some of the pressure off the main supply, the reticulated supply, by self-providing the water that lands on our roofs, and at least using that to water gardens and things as the easiest, cheapest option for using rainwater tanks in residential areas. Some people will go further and flush toilets and use it for washing machines, etc. Another important source, of course, is groundwater. So Tamworth has access to the drift wells, the Paradise drift wells, which are used as an emergency source. Other towns and cities rely on groundwater as their dominant source for drinking water. Sometimes the groundwater is connected to what's going on the surface, so we can have a shallow aquifer that will be influenced by what's going on in the river. Sometimes we can tap into much deeper confined aquifers, the Great Artesian Basin, which are somewhat independent to the surface water happening. In fact, I was giving a similar presentation in Bellingen a couple of weeks ago. So in Bellingen, they got into a situation where Bellingen has 3 groundwater bores that it takes its drinking water from, right up here, just to the west of town, just up waterfall away from town. And in Bellingen, in the drought that we just went through, 2017, 18, 19, the Bellingen River was running very, very low. And they were very concerned that their groundwater supply was not going to be sustainable during that period, because the groundwater wells were dropping as well, because there's a close connectivity between what's going on in those wells and what's going on in the river. They've since done a bit of research and found out there's quite a bit of stored water underneath that as well, which has been a good news story for Tamworth. Other cities during the drought, this is Burke. In Burke, right on the Barwon. But during about 2019, that source became unavailable, and in Burke they started to tap into the Great Artesian Basin. So groundwater became the drinking water supply for Burke for the first time ever at that period. It's a different quality water. It's a little bit saline, but it got them through that period. Other towns, Broken Hill, back when they were building the Wentworth to Broken Hill pipeline to bring water up from the Murray River, and there was very little water in Menindee Lakes. They were relying on groundwater at that time too, but it was too salty to drink, and so they installed this temporary desalination plant. So taking the salt out of the groundwater by filtering through membranes. Certainly a technical solution that is available, but there are a number of challenges associated with doing that. One of them is the cost. It's an expensive way to produce water. But another one is, and particularly for inland environments, a real limitation sometimes for these types of processes, is what do you do with that salt? And it's very hard to get environmental approval to be able to dispose of the salt that you're taking out of the water, whether you can't just discharge it back into a waterway, at least not a freshwater waterway, and you have to be very careful about land application as well, because otherwise it will end up just washing off or infiltrating down into the groundwater table. But that's sometimes a solution that can be applied. Similar thing happened in Walgett. You just heard about Walgett, where the 2 rivers meet, the Barwon and the Namoi. Walgett ran out of water around the same time, 2019. They were also provided with a desalination solution so that they could use groundwater from a grant from the New South Wales government. But we really started to see some of those challenges come to the fore in this case. Challenges, first of all, about managing the brine. They never really came up with a good solution of what's going to happen with all of the salt that's being produced. But also about having the technical skills in town, the technical skills available to be able to operate a sophisticated treatment plant like this. So that plant really struggled to get up and running and to be able to provide a significant contribution to Wildwood's water supply at that time. So just pointing to the fact that these solutions exist, but they're not simple. They can be complicated, especially for smaller communities. Another way that we've seen water being managed is you build a pipeline and you tap into another water supply somewhere. We saw that for Guyra around the same time, the height of the drought. In Guyra, they built a pipeline down to Malpas Dam, which is Armidale's drinking water supply, just to the north of Armidale, between Armidale and Guyra. And we were able to secure Guyra's drinking water supplies at that time. Obviously, the demand in Guyra is much, much smaller than the demand in Armidale, so it's not a huge additional contribution, but ultimately it is a zero-sum game. Right? Any additional water that Guyra takes, well, Armidale's running out of water too, so it's just one more straw in that cup of water. So we can identify some of these solutions as potentially short-term, particularly emergency type solutions, but in the longer term, we're not making more water, we're just distributing it in different ways. There have been other examples of big regional sharing of regional water supplies. So this is Coffs Harbour and Grafton. So traditionally, Grafton gets its drinking water from the Nimboida River, Coffs Harbour from the Orara River. They now have this pipeline that is built between them. They built a big new dam small new dam up at Grafton called the Shannon Creek Dam. And there's a pipeline which can actually deliver water in either direction. So if either city was to run out of water, nearly always it comes from Grafton to Coffs Harbour, but it could go the other way. And it's a way of being able to maybe flatten out some of those peaks during extreme times, during droughts. Coffs Harbour's got quite a small water storage, Karini Dam, which is an off-river storage, and so they're able to take water out of the Orara River as they need it. Keep it relatively full, but ultimately it is a small storage. So if Coffs Harbour ever got into a lot of trouble, then they can top that up with water from further north. Another important solution, here's an example from Tamworth, you're probably all very familiar with. When you were at the height of the drought, 2018, 2019, there was concern about the water that you're taking from Chaffey. How much you take from Chaffey, you end up with less water down at the Kalala water filtration plant because of the efficiency of that water transfer. You lose water along the way as it seeps into the ground. And hence the Chaffey to Kalala, Chaffey to Dungown pipeline was constructed in order to make that transfer of water more efficient. So the water you take from the dam is the water that arrives at the water filtration plant. They're I guess, the fairly conventional ways of dealing with water shortages and trying to shore up shortages during extreme periods. This is a less conventional solution. So this is Orange, and at the end of the Millennium Drought, Orange was working on this solution that involves taking urban stormwater. So in Orange, they take normally Summer Park Dam. I think you can just see Summer Park Dam in that picture. Summer Park Dam is their main storage, and Summer Park Dam has a conventional catchment. It's rural land, and when it rains, water runs off into Summer Park Dam, but not so much in drought. When that catchment dries out, even the rain that falls doesn't run off into Summer Park Dam. They don't get a lot of runoff because the ground is dry and it soaks up that water. But what they found through developing this scheme is that they capture the water that lands on the actual town, and the town is very different to the catchment because the town is full of impervious surfaces, concrete footpaths, roofs, roads, etc. So the water doesn't soak down into the ground, it runs off. So therefore they are able to collect this additional water off the town through the creek that runs through Orange, and they happen to have a nice little storage at the top of that pitcher that they're able to keep that water in, and they actually treat it to a degree in that little storage and then transfer it into Sooner Park Dam for storage. And here's actually a quote from the ex-mayor now, Reg Kidd was the mayor back in 2019. I can't quite read it from here, I haven't got it on the screen, but basically what he's saying is that during the last couple of weeks we had a bit of rain. It still rains in droughts, but we don't get runoff during droughts because the ground is so dry. So we had a bit of rain, none of that rain translated into runoff into Sooner Park Dam, but the water that landed on the city in our stormwater harvesting system did generate, it's not a huge amount of water, but it did generate some water last weekend or whatever it was. So these types of systems, because they're different to the conventional system, they provide a degree of resilience because they're effective and they produce water under different conditions to when the conventional water supply will continue to produce water. So that's been an important, successful project for Orange. They're very proud of it. They're expanding it to a larger part of Orange to increase the catchment. And other cities like Bathurst are now looking at developing the same types of schemes as a result of the success that Orange had. They built it after the Millennium Drought, but it really came to the fore in the most recent drought. Here's a photo I took off Twitter one day. This lady, she lives in Armidale, I think, was getting on a plane in Armidale and took a photo out the window, and she's tweeted something like, it says, Armidale, where the only green patch on the landscape is around the sewage treatment plant. And you can see that it's true, that there's all this dry area, and then there's this sort of farmland that the sewage is part of the sewage treatment plant where they irrigate fodder around the treatment plant, and it stays nice and green all year round. But it really points to the fact that that's a reliable source. Wastewater treatment plants continue to produce water even during serious droughts because we keep flushing the toilets, having showers. The showers might be shorter, but we're still having them. There's still water coming through the wastewater treatment plant regardless. So lots of cities, of course, have observed this fact. There are very few cities left in New South Wales that don't do something with their treated effluent from their wastewater treatment plant. Lots of them have identified that as a useful, important, valuable resource for things like watering sporting fields, ovals, the local golf course, the local airport. Here's an example from Wagga, where they're able to keep these important community assets operating, which would otherwise dry out in a serious drought and become unusable. They're able to keep them operating during that drought. And as you can see, a couple of dot points here, there are other advantages that come from being able to make use of their wastewater as well. They have to purchase drinking water from the county council, the Riverina Water County Council. So there's savings there that they don't have to purchase as much water to water these fields. And also they have to pay to discharge sewage. The EPA's impose cost penalties on nitrogen and salt and things that get discharged into waterways, so they're saving that money as well by reusing that water rather than discharging it into the Murrumbidgee in this case. In order to make really good use of that water, so one of the limitations of that scheme that we just saw is that it's purely an irrigation scheme. So that's great for those purposes and for getting the sporting fields through drought. But if your water recycling scheme is purely an irrigation scheme, then it's going to be a very seasonal demand scheme. You can't convince the local golf course to keep watering when the greens are boggy. So when it's raining, you're going to have too much of this water and you're going to be discharging it and disposing of it, and therefore not making good use of that full volume of water because of the irrigation, the seasonal nature of irrigation. So to get around that, one way to get around that is to have very, very large storage, a dedicated storage specifically for recycled water, as they have in Cootamundra. Cootamundra has this 80 megalitre storage dam, and therefore they're able to flatten out some of those peaks in demand and use that water when it's not raining and save it up when it is raining. Most towns and cities don't have a spare 80 megalitre storage dam or a place to build one lying around for recycled water, so that's a bit of a luxury. Another way to deal with it is to have a big, reliable industrial user, a non-irrigation user, And that's what Orange does with its wastewater. One of the reasons that they moved to looking at the stormwater harvesting scheme is their wastewater was spoken for. All of their wastewater goes to the Cadia gold mine, which is something that they're happy about in Orange. It supports local employment. Nobody in Orange wants to see the gold mine closed down. But ultimately, that's where their wastewater goes. It's a very reliable source for the industrial user, but it's not available for other uses within the city. But if you have a reliable source that would otherwise be using the same water that you use for drinking water, then you completely offset that drinking water demand. And that's what happens in Wollongong. So the Wollongong, it's a bit hard to see. If you look up the top right-hand corner of this picture, you might see some tanks. It's the Wollongong Sewage Treatment Plant. And then down the bottom left corner is BlueScope Steel, Australia's largest integrated steel manufacturer, more or less under the fence. Wollongong Sewage Treatment Plant are able to pipe purified recycled water. It's membrane-treated recycled water, so they're taking a lot of the salt out of it into BlueScope Steel, and BlueScope Steel use it for steel manufacturing and dust suppression and other uses. It's not irrigation, so it's not seasonal demand, it's very reliable demand. And before they were doing that, and this is the important point, before they were doing that, BlueScope Steel was using water that came from Avon Dam, which is Wollongong's drinking water supply. So it's the same water, so every drop of water that they now use from the wastewater treatment plant is a saving compared to what was happening previously. We can also use recycled water at homes, and there are plenty of towns around Australia, towns and suburbs around Australia that now have what we sometimes call a purple pipe system or a dual reticulation system, where the houses have two pipes coming into them. You can see the two water meters here. One is the conventional drinking water supply, and the other one comes from treated effluent from the sewage treatment plant, usually quite well treated because it's coming into homes and it needs to be safe for accidental exposure through kids playing with the sprinkler, etc. So it's usually quite highly treated recycled water coming into homes and is used mostly for outdoor use on the gardens, but often in a lot of these estates, for new estates, they've plumbed them into toilets, sometimes washing machines, to try and maximise the use of this water. So this seems like a great solution, and it has been very useful in many areas, but there are a number of limitations. One limitation is that it really only applies to new developments. It's very hard to retrofit a system where you've got to dig up every street and replumb every house in order to get a second water supply into the houses. So it never happens. It's a new development area only, which means it's slow to roll out. It takes decades. You can't retrofit the bulk of the city. It's only the new growth areas. Another limitation is that it generally is mostly an irrigation supply. It mostly is used for watering gardens. So therefore it is highly seasonal, therefore it is difficult to maximise the use of that resource without having periods where you've got too much or too little water to be able to supply what you need. And a lot of them end up topping up the system with drinking water. Rouse Hill in Sydney, for example, has had to top up that system with drinking water during dry periods in order to flatten out some of the peaks in demand. Another really important limitation, we were talking before about rainwater tanks and how rainwater tanks are really useful for watering the garden and taking the pressure off the drinking water supplies. If you have one of these, you have no use for a rainwater tank, right? Because if you have a recycled water system coming in that's supposed to water the garden, therefore that's the same demand, that's the same use that the rainwater tank was going to contribute to. So if you've got all this recycled water and you've got the rainwater tank, you can really only use one or the other, or half of each, but you're not making full use of that resource if you're doing that. So it sort of takes away some of those other possible opportunities for reducing demand on water supplies. So recognising that, some cities have started to look at, well, how can we use that recycled water in a way that overcomes all of these different barriers that we're talking about, being highly seasonal, competing with rainwater tanks, and there are issues around costs and retrofitting to old areas. So here's a scheme from Perth that Perth has built. There's a big sewage treatment plant to the north of Perth called the Beanyip wastewater treatment plant. And Perth built this scheme where they decided instead of investing in a dual reticulation scheme and having two separate water supplies, they'll invest in the treatment. So they purify the water through reverse osmosis and ultraviolet disinfection. So it's a very high quality of water suitable for drinking. And they put that back into the drinking water supply. Perth doesn't have big dams like Tamworth or Sydney. It only has very small dams. Most of their drinking water supplies traditionally come from groundwater. Now a lot of it's seawater desalination, but groundwater was their conventional supply. So they top up the groundwater supply by pumping this water back underground, topping up the aquifer. They started operating this system in 2017, topping up 40 megalitres per day. And just this year, they've expanded that scheme and commissioned the doubling of that scheme, so they can now produce 80 megalitres per day, which tops up their drinking water supply. It's their storage, is the aquifer, and the water is the same water that is supplied for drinking water, and so therefore when you offset it with rainwater tanks and everything else, you still get that benefit. This, of course, is an example of what we call managed aquifer recharge, taking an aquifer and intentionally putting more water back down into that aquifer. And there's a lot of interest. CSIRO are doing a lot of research at the moment on opportunities for managed aquifer recharge around Australia. You can do it with purified treated wastewater, as I've described here. There's a city in South Australia, Salisbury, that does it with stormwater. And even it's a way of just storing other water that might be available from a river or whatever. If you don't have an alternative storage, then topping up an aquifer is potentially an alternative way to store that water, evaporation free. In Queensland, they've taken a different approach. In Brisbane, they don't have groundwater supplies, they have dams, like Sydney. So after the end of the Millennium Drought, they built this scheme called the Western Corridor Recycled Water Scheme, which is a massive water recycling scheme. Takes water from 6 wastewater treatment plants around southeast Queensland, delivers it to 3 advanced water treatment plants that use these processes that are shown here: ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet advanced oxidation processes, and then chlorinates that water. And that water then is available then and has been approved, it's all been validated and approved by Queensland Health to go back into Lake Wivenhoe Dam, which is their main drinking water supply. It's never actually done that. That water's only been used for industrial purposes. A couple of big power stations around southeast Queensland being the main users. Swanbank gas-fired power station and Tarong power station. But the infrastructure is built. The main reason that it's never been used is that they built it coming out of the Millennium Drought. It was fully commissioned, ready to start operating around about 2009, late 2009. By that time, Wivenhoe was filling up, and the Queensland government lost the appetite to do anything about it with something that might have been controversial, like recycled water. And by 2011, as you'll recall, Wivenhoe was actually flooding, spilling. So there was nowhere to put that water. There was no room left to store that water. You can't top up an already full dam, but that scheme still exists and it's still on the drawing board for South East Queensland's water strategy as one of the steps they take going into the future when particular triggers are hit regarding how much water is in Wivenhoe. In Sydney, we have a different approach. In Sydney, we have a scheme, the St Mary's Advanced Water Treatment Plant in Western Sydney. It actually takes water from 3 wastewater treatment plants, and it's Quakers Hill, St Mary's, and Penrith wastewater treatment plants, and it treats them through the same technology, reverse osmosis, membrane technology, and we put that water back into the Nepean River, the Hawkesbury Nepean River, about 17 kilometres upstream of a water filtration plant. It's called the North Richmond Water Filtration Plant, which takes that water out again of the river. It's blended with other water, and it's travelled 17 kilometres downstream, comes back out again, and it becomes the drinking water supply for that part of northwest Sydney around Richmond and Windsor. We don't talk about it very much. People tend to say that Sydney doesn't do water recycling. Sydney does do water recycling, and it's not accidental, it's very intentional. In fact, I was involved in the health risk assessment for this project, and when we went through the health risk assessment with Sydney Water and New South Wales Health, it was very openly, very clearly a potable reuse scheme, purified recycled water for drinking. Then there are cities in the US and other places that have been going one step further and saying, well, we do want to purify we do want to purify this water and provide purified recycled water as our drinking water resource, but we don't have a river to put it in, we don't have a groundwater aquifer to top up, we don't have a big dam, big surface water storage that we want to use. El Paso is just commissioning this scheme now where they will actually take the purified recycled water straight from the advanced water treatment plant directly into the drinking water supply without a river or an aquifer or a dam in between. They're not the first city in the US to do it, despite some of the language here saying that. There's a few technicalities that make them feel like they're the first. But there are other cities, Big Spring in Texas is one, that are doing very, very similar things. And in Namibia, they've been doing it for about 40 years. In the capital of Namibia, Windhoek. So that's the way that we manage our desalination plant in Sydney. We don't have a dam that water goes into. It doesn't go into Warragamba, it just goes straight into the drinking water supply. So they're just doing the same thing as we do with seawater desalination. When we look into the future, towns across Australia and across New South Wales are planning for a future where purified recycled water does become an important part of their drinking water supplies. This is Rouse Water, supplies water to Ballina, Lismore and Byron Bay. And I don't know how well you can read it, but as you go across the slide there, you're sort of working into the future, 20 years down the track, over on that right-hand side, they're saying, well, we've got all of these different options, different ways of using recycled water that are part of this strategy. I think there's an example there where they have recycled water going into a dam, so a bit like Wivenhoe in Brisbane, South East Queensland. They have another alternative where it goes into a groundwater supply, so like Perth does, and they even right at the bottom, I think they're flagging that they're also looking at direct potable reuse, so straight into the distribution system. Not tomorrow, not next year, but a decade or so down the track. This is part of where they're working, and in fact they have a tender out at the moment to build a demonstration plant for Rouse Water in order to start that community discussion, because they see this as a long-term strategy and it's not something you spring on people. You work towards it over a decade or more, as all of the other successful cities have done. Don't mean to endorse this character, but only to say that this conversation has started a little bit in Tamworth, and I think that's a great thing that some people have been prepared to initiate that discussion, and it's something that should be encouraged. In Sydney, the Greater Sydney Water Strategy came out about a month ago, and when we look at the Greater Sydney Water Strategy, this little bar chart over here is really, I think, insightful. What it talks about is how much rainfall independent supplies we have as part of our overall water supply. And Sydney's that first bar chart, the little one, and we compare it to, I think, Perth, Melbourne and Adelaide. And we say, well, Perth, Melbourne and Adelaide have a lot more rainfall independent supplies than Sydney does. And this is the reason that Sydney tosses and turns and ends up back on water restrictions so frequently, is that when there's a drought, we're very vulnerable to drought because our water supplies are vulnerable to drought because they're heavily rainfall dependent. So we have about 15% that comes from our seawater desalination plant, better than nothing. But if you compare it to Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide, the ambition here is to say, well, if we did have more rainfall independent supply, which could be more seawater desalination, or it could be purified recycled water, then that would have a big advantage in terms of flattening out those peaks and helping us to get through those drought periods when they come along. So when we look at the Greater Sydney Water Strategy, it talks about where we might be able to pick up different sustainable yield, gigalitres per year in water going into the future. Can't quite read it from here, but it talks about conserving water. There's 20 gigalitres a year or something, that might be 40 gigalitres per year, that is more or less available to us through water efficiency practices. And then there's 140 gigalitres per year that there is potentially available through various rainfall independent supplies that Sydney Water has identified and we can work towards developing in the future. So Sydney's not going to be building another dam. We're not going to be building a pipeline to bring water in from somewhere else. Our future water is rainfall independent supplies. It's a question of whether it's seawater desalination, purified recycled water, or a combination of both. A little bit about some of the options that have been raised talking about Tamworth. So I know in Tamworth, Most of the drinking water, of course, comes from Chaffey. I'm sure Bruce will talk about this in much more detail. Most of the drinking water comes from, most of the water supply, I should say, comes from Chaffey. It's not just drinking water. A smaller amount from Dungowan Dam. And so the current proposal, of course, is to raise the Dungowan Dam wall, and by doing that, being able to capture an extra yield. How much? Is it? How much? 7,000 gigs per year, which is effectively going to come from water that would have otherwise spilt over the top of the existing dam, so potentially water that might have ended up on floodplains during the floods, so water that would be in contact with the groundwater table, or else water that would make its way down into the Nemoy system. One of the reasons that that proposal has been scrutinised by Infrastructure Australia and others is that they've suggested that there hasn't been enough attention based on the alternative options for where else Tamworth might be able to manage to get some water from. And these were identified as perhaps some of the realistic options that are available. The bottom one is just buying up general security licences, converting general security licences into the drinking water supply allocation for Tamworth. But the top one is really the one that's had the most attention, and all the top one is saying is that you have increased urban reserve, which means that you have the same licences for general security and for Tamworth's drinking water supply, but instead of allowing Chaffey to be drawn down by the general security licences, you have a reserve that's somewhat bigger than the current 14 gigalitre reserve, so that Tamworth's 16 megs per year, I think I said gigs per year, Tamworth 16 gigalitres per year, becomes more reliable because you're not going to be drawn down as much. And so that's one of the alternatives that organisations like Infrastructure Australia are saying there should be more attention to thinking about, well, is this an easier, cheaper way of addressing that drinking water supply shortage. In the future, this is my last slide, in the future, I think this is the sort of thing that all towns and cities should be looking at. This is the Lower Hunter water strategy, Lower Hunter water security plan, so Newcastle. And what they look at are short-term options, things that you can do relatively quickly. And they're talking about building a desalination plant at Belmont, off the coast of Lake Macquarie there. And then over a longer period, they're talking about a pipeline. It's a pipeline that's going to connect different dams and potentially bring new allocations, new licences down to the Hunter. They need to be able to secure those licences to do that. But in the longer term, and it is decades, it's 20 years off into the future, they are planning for purified recycled water. They've been very open about it because they recognise that you need to start this community discussion a decade or so before you expect to get there, so that it's not something you spring on people at the last minute. So it's these sort of stepwise, short-term solutions and long-term solutions is really the way that all cities should be thinking, towns and cities should be thinking in terms of where they're going to get their drinking water supplies in the future. Way overstayed my welcome, I'm sorry, I'll try to go quickly. But I'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards, after we also hear from Bruce about some of that.